Do I belong here? Watch and learn. Michelle Obama turned, her eyes locking onto the woman who had just questioned her presence. The silence that followed was deafening. Attendees shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what would happen next. With a poised smile, Michelle simply gestured toward the grand stage, her stage. "I suppose you'll find out in a moment," she said, her voice steady yet piercing. The woman's face drained of color as realization set in. She had just dismissed one of the most influential women in the world. Have you ever had to prove you belonged in a space you earned? What did you do? Drop your thoughts below, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. The grand ballroom, bathed in a soft golden glow from the crystal chandeliers overhead, exuded an air of opulence and exclusivity. Every detail of the room had been carefully arranged to project wealth, power, and success. Pristine white linens draped over long banquet tables, each adorned with delicate floral arrangements, while polished silver cutlery gleamed under the warm light. The hum of polite conversations filled the space, a blend of laughter and words, about philanthropy, social change, and the lofty ideals of collective action. Champagne flutes clinked together in toast after toast as the high-profile guests, celebrities, politicians, business moguls, moved through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries and smiling at one another with practiced ease. The evening's purpose, fundraiser for education reform, was a noble cause, but beneath the surface there was an undeniable sense of privilege and detachment. Conversations about change were often framed in terms of charity, as if social issues could be solved with a few well-placed donations and speeches. Yet the real work of transformation was too often overlooked, as those in positions of power celebrated the idea of social justice without truly confronting the inequalities that fueled it. It was a space where many of the problems the event aimed to address remained safely contained within well-meaning speeches, never truly questioning the systems that kept the privileged at the top. As Michelle stepped into the room, a sharp sense of irony gripped her. This was a space she had worked so hard to be part of, fighting for years to make a difference in education, in healthcare, and in the lives of those too often ignored. Yet, in this room, filled with people whose wealth could undoubtedly change lives, she felt the weight of exclusion. The moment she entered, the room seemed to part, creating just enough space for her to slip through unnoticed by some, but fully acknowledged by others. Some people, recognizing her instantly, gave a polite nod or exchanged pleasantries, while others didn't seem to register her presence at all. It was an unspoken reminder of the lines that still divided this world, where the faces of power were often unfamiliar to those who didn't look like the ones in charge. Michelle couldn't help but notice the way she was treated in the same space, where she had once stood as First Lady of the United States, where her very presence should have been a reminder of the difference one person could make. Yet, here she was, another black woman in a room of privilege, trying to fight for the very change these people claimed to support. The irony was impossible to ignore. Michelle Obama entered the grand ballroom with a quiet confidence, her movements graceful yet grounded, every step purposeful but unhurried. Dressed in a simple yet elegant outfit, a deep blue dress that draped perfectly over her figure and a pair of understated heels, Michelle's presence was powerful, yet unassuming. Her attire was a stark contrast to the flashy, designer-clad guests around her, but it spoke volumes about her character. There was no need for extravagance or attention-seeking in her world. Michelle knew that her voice, her work, and her purpose were what truly mattered. As the First Lady of the United States, Michelle had held the highest office in the land, where her every move was scrutinized, her every word weighed carefully. But her time in the White House had never been about the title. It had always been about using her platform to speak for those who couldn't be heard. Over the years, she became a beacon of hope for those advocating for social justice, healthy living, and educational reform. Michelle's work had touched the lives of millions, from inspiring young girls to pursue education and careers in science, to advocating for healthier school lunches for children across the country. But here, in this room, Michelle was just another attendee, one of many who had dedicated their time and effort to causes larger than themselves. In a space dominated by wealth and status, Michelle was used to being overlooked in ways that stung, even if they were subtle. People knew her name, they recognized her accomplishments, yet the same people who had cheered her on in public spaces seemed indifferent to her presence now. Despite her long-standing dedication to the community, her years of tireless work, and the well-earned recognition she had received for her advocacy, she was still just one of the crowd in a space where the privilege and influence of those around her often defined their worth. Michelle's purpose tonight, however, was not for the applause or the admiration of others. It was for the cause she believed in deeply: education for all, no matter one's background, race, or economic status. She had spent her life pushing for a world where every child, regardless of their circumstances, had access to a quality education. That was why she was here tonight, to speak, to advocate, and to continue the work she had always fought for. But as the evening progressed, Michelle began to notice something unsettling. While many were eager to hear her speak, some of the guests in the room seemed to view her not as the leader she was, but as an outsider. She could feel the subtle shift, the way people assumed she was merely there to support a cause, not to lead it. It was an uncomfortable realization for Michelle, but it was one that she had encountered countless times before. In rooms like this, where power often took a familiar form, Michelle was still fighting to be seen for who she truly was, not just as a former First Lady or a famous figure, but as a passionate advocate for change. Karen, a well-known socialite, and one of the key sponsors of the event, couldn't help but notice Michelle as she entered the ballroom. With her carefully maintained appearance, sleek designer dress, perfectly styled hair, and an air of unmistakable wealth, Karen had always prided herself on recognizing who was truly important in these circles. As Michelle walked into the room, however, Karen's eyes narrowed just slightly, sizing her up. Her expression was one of quiet judgment, and it was clear that she didn't recognize Michelle, nor did she seem inclined to inquire. She glanced at Michelle, taking her in from head to toe, a slight furrow of confusion crossing her face. The subtle skepticism was almost imperceptible, but Michelle knew it all too well. The quiet assumption that someone like her didn't belong here. Karen's lips curled into a brief, almost imperceptible sneer before she quickly turned her attention elsewhere, her gaze flicking back and forth as if to reassure herself that she was in the right space, with the right people. Karen muttered, something under her breath, just loud enough for those around her to hear, but not enough to draw attention. I didn't realize we were inviting people like her to speak tonight. Interesting choice. The words stung more than they should have, not just because of the blatant judgment they carried, but because of the insidiousness of the assumption behind them. Karen's tone wasn't overtly hostile, but it was laced with a condescending judgment that cut deeper than a loud insult could. She had made up her mind about Michelle long before she even had the chance to introduce herself. In Karen's eyes, Michelle wasn't an accomplished, globally recognized figure. She was just another black woman who didn't belong in the space they had worked so hard to cultivate. As Michelle made her way through the crowd, moving toward the front of the room to greet the event organizers, she could feel the weight of Karen's gaze following her. Though Karen's words had been quiet, their venom wasn't lost on Michelle. It wasn't the first time she had encountered prejudice masked as polite indifference, but the sting still lingered. The quiet sneer, the whispered comment. It was all too familiar. It was the kind of subtle malice that people like Karen never acknowledged, but which left its mark on the people they chose to dismiss. Michelle's posture remained unbroken. She held her head high, despite the silent judgment and the needling whispers that floated through the air. She had learned long ago not to confront every subtle slight, especially in a room filled with people who seemed unwilling to see beyond their assumptions. So she let the moment pass. But inside, the hurt lingered, like a shadow that refused to go away. Michelle had learned to carry it with grace, but the weight was always there, insidious, quietly oppressive, and deeply rooted in the systems that allowed it to persist. As Michelle made her way through the crowd, the tension between her and Karen didn't go unnoticed. Several guests caught the exchange, their eyes flickering toward Michelle and Karen in a mix of curiosity and discomfort. But none of them spoke. Not immediately anyway. Instead, they allowed the moment to linger in the air, uncomfortable but unwilling to confront the issue head-on. Among the bystanders was Jessica, a young social activist who had been silently observing the interactions from a distance. She admired Michelle's work, had been following her campaigns for years, and believed deeply in the causes Michelle championed. But when she overheard Karen's dismissive remark, something inside her twisted. The undertones of racism were unmistakable, and Jessica felt a pang of discomfort. Her instinct told her to speak up, to call Karen out on her blatant prejudice. But in the same breath she hesitated. This was a high-profile event, and she was just a newcomer in a room filled with people far more established than she was. She was torn. Should she challenge Karen's remarks and risk disrupting the social dynamics of the event? Or should she remain silent, avoid rocking the boat, and protect her own position? Across the room, Jake, a journalist covering the event, witnessed the exchange as well. His unease grew as he saw Michelle's poise in the face of Karen's quiet condescension. As a journalist, he recognized Michelle's significance, but he couldn't help feeling uncomfortable about how to intervene. He wasn't sure if it was his place to step into the conversation, especially in such a public setting where his own professional credibility might be questioned. The silence of the bystanders spoke volumes. Michelle, despite being surrounded by people, couldn't shake the feeling of isolation. She had been the one to work hard for her place in this room, and yet the subtle ways in which she was viewed as other remained ever present. Have you ever been in a situation where you witnessed prejudice but didn't know how to respond? What would you have done? As the evening wore on, Michelle felt the weight of Karen's quiet scrutiny intensifying. Though Karen's comments remained veiled in polite language, they were impossible to ignore. Michelle, who had spent much of her life navigating the complexities of public life, recognized these small acts of discrimination, too subtle to call out directly, but too significant to overlook. While Michelle was engaged in conversation with a group of guests discussing the importance of educational reform, Karen approached them, her sharp eyes immediately zeroing in on Michelle. "Isn't this more of an event for, people who are actually part of the charity scene?" Karen asked, her voice a bit too casual, the words coming out as though they were meant to be harmless, but the undertone was unmistakable. Michelle paused for a moment, her smile not faltering, though she felt a sting of discomfort. Karen's assumption was clear. Michelle, a woman of influence and power, didn't belong here. She couldn't fathom how someone like Michelle, with her background and her advocacy for social justice, could have a legitimate place in a room filled with people accustomed to wealth and status. The comment was an unspoken judgment, a dismissive look at the validity of Michelle's presence in a world that was often quick to judge based on superficial markers of success. Throughout the evening, these subtle slights continued to pile up. Karen would occasionally drop another offhand remark, questioning Michelle's credentials or the extent of her experience in the charity world. "How do you manage to balance family life with such a demanding role?" Karen once asked. Her question masked as concern, but undercut by an underlying doubt, as if Michelle's advocacy was something that could only exist in the spaces that people like Karen allowed. With each remark, Michelle's frustration built quietly. She could feel the assumptions Karen made about her as a black woman in a predominantly white, privileged space weighing down on her. Though she kept her composure, a sense of isolation began to settle in. It wasn't the overt racism that one might expect, but the quiet, insidious nature of the slights that made her question her place in this circle, despite the years of work, advocacy, and contribution she had made. The social fabric of the event, once a place where change and goodwill seemed possible, now felt strained. Was she truly accepted here, or was she just another figurehead, tolerated for the moment but ultimately dismissed when it truly mattered? Tension between her grace and Karen's assumptions hung in the air, each subtle comment pushing Michelle further from the sense of belonging she had fought so hard to achieve. Internally, Michelle felt a growing sense of frustration gnawing at her. She had been here before. She had faced prejudice time and time again, throughout her childhood in Chicago, during her academic pursuits, and even during her time in the White House. The subtle assumptions, the dismissals based on her skin color, the whispers about her qualifications. They were nothing new. She had long learned to confront these slights, to brush them off, to rise above them, but this situation felt different. The microaggressions here, particularly Karen's subtle remarks, were personal. They weren't overt or loud. They were quiet, whispered assumptions, but they dug deeper than the obvious attacks. They poked at something Michelle had worked so hard to keep hidden, the feeling of not belonging, of constantly having to prove her worth in spaces that were never meant for her. Even now, in this moment of celebration and philanthropy, she felt the sting of being underestimated. Her mind flashed back to her early years, being the only black student in a class full of white peers, being told that her achievements were anomalies, being asked how she managed to get so far. In those moments, she had been made to feel like she had to prove she was more than qualified to exist in spaces that were designed for people like Karen. The memory of those early moments of doubt and struggle flared up again, as if the years of progress, of fighting to carve out space for herself, hadn't changed anything. As Karen's words replayed in Michelle's mind, she couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of isolation that now settled over her. Here she was, surrounded by high-profile guests, many of whom had applauded her efforts in the past, but in this space it felt like she was invisible. Despite her public success, despite all the battles she had fought and won, the reality remained. Many still saw her through the lens of their biases. The frustration in her chest began to rise, but Michelle fought to keep it contained. She reminded herself of the importance of grace under pressure. This moment wasn't just about her. It was bigger than Karen, bigger than this event. She had a responsibility to model resilience and self-control, to show others that even in the face of adversity, one must stand firm. But as she forced herself to smile and engage with the crowd, she wondered, how much longer could she keep up this facade? How long could she suppress the anger burning beneath the surface before it was impossible to ignore? Michelle took a slow, steadying breath. She had learned to be the bigger person, to respond with patience and grace. But tonight, the weight of her emotions pressed harder than it ever had before, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep them hidden. As Michelle moved gracefully through the room, engaging with various guests and listening to their comments, a growing sense of isolation began to settle over her. Despite the well-dressed crowd of influential individuals, she felt utterly alone. Her steps were confident, but the weight of the subtle slight she had encountered lingered with every word spoken to her. Most of the guests seemed oblivious to the tension, too caught up in their own conversations to notice the discomfort Michelle was enduring. The quiet forms of racism she was facing, remarks masked as casual questions or polite disbelief, were so ingrained in their world that they hardly raised an eyebrow. It was as if Michelle's very presence had become a disturbance in a space where such uncomfortable truths were unwelcome. The lack of support from those around her stung in a way that the comments themselves did not. There was no ally stepping forward, no one to acknowledge the unfairness of what was happening. The indifference from the crowd, the silence that hung in the air, only made her feel more exposed. Jessica, a young social activist who had admired Michelle from afar, had witnessed the entire exchange between Michelle and Karen. She recognized the injustice immediately, but she hesitated. In a room full of powerful figures, her voice felt small and insignificant. The risk of confrontation felt too great. Would speaking up damage her standing? Would it be seen as inappropriate or out of place in the room? Her hesitation was palpable as she stood by, torn between her desire to confront the injustice and her fear of disrupting the social dynamics. Jake, the journalist, was equally paralyzed by his role in the situation. He had seen the subtle prejudice unfold, but like Jessica, he felt unsure of how to respond. As a journalist, he understood the importance of objectivity. But this was different. Michelle wasn't just a figure he was covering. She was an advocate, a leader, and someone who had worked tirelessly for the causes they both cared about. Still, he hesitated. Would speaking out jeopardize his professional standing? He felt the weight of his silence just as heavily as the weight of Michelle's presence in the room. The more Michelle moved through the crowd, the more she felt the sting of being othered. Despite her achievements, despite the battles she had fought to carve out a place for herself in spaces like this, she could not shake the feeling of being out of place. Her every movement seemed scrutinized, not for her ideas, her accomplishments, or her contributions, but for her very presence in a room where people like her were rarely seen as equals. This was a familiar feeling, a feeling she had known throughout her life. It wasn't an isolated incident. It was systemic, woven into the fabric of the very spaces she had fought so hard to enter. And yet, she remained composed. She would always remain composed. But inside, the loneliness she felt in that moment echoed louder than any words could. At a key moment in the evening, after yet another brush with Karen's veiled condescension, Jessica reached a tipping point. She had been standing off to the side, unsure of how to respond, her internal conflict mounting. She had seen enough. The weight of Michelle's struggle, her grace in the face of silent hostility, was too much to ignore any longer. The indifference of the crowd was just as hurtful as the comments Michelle had endured. But now, Jessica realized she had to take action. Despite her initial hesitation, Jessica decided she could not remain a bystander any longer. With quiet determination, Jessica stepped forward, making her way through the crowd. Her heart raced, but she held herself steady as she approached Michelle. "I've been following your work for years," she said, her voice calm but filled with genuine admiration. "Your efforts in education have inspired me to work harder. In my own community, it's an honor to meet you." Her words were simple, but they carried power. In that moment, Jessica was not just offering praise. She was challenging the subtle, pervasive prejudice that had hung over the room like a cloud. By publicly acknowledging Michelle's impact, Jessica disrupted the quiet marginalization Michelle had been subjected to. Her words were an act of solidarity, a quiet but powerful gesture that reverberated through the space. Michelle's eyes softened as she looked at Jessica, her appreciation for the gesture clear. The tension that had clouded her mind began to lift slightly, and she felt a quiet sense of relief. The words, though simple, were a reminder that she was seen, that the work she had done, years of advocacy, tireless efforts, was recognized and appreciated. It was validation in a place where her value had been questioned. Jessica's act of support did not demand attention or applause, but it sparked a quiet shift in the room. Slowly, others began to take notice. A few guests who had been standing nearby, who'd been silent observers up until then, began to speak out as well. One by one, they shared their admiration for Michelle's work in education reform and social justice. Jake, the journalist who had been observing from a distance, stepped forward with a nod to Michelle. "Your work has changed the landscape of education reform," he said, his voice steady. "You've made a difference that goes beyond words." As these small acts of support began to grow, the atmosphere of the room shifted. What had felt like an invisible battle, one that Michelle had been fighting alone, now had a visible shift in momentum. People who had once hesitated to speak up now found their voices, their quiet praise amplifying the message of solidarity. Michelle felt the energy in the room change. There was still work to be done, but for the first time that evening, she felt a sense of camaraderie and support, something that had been sorely lacking just moments before. The subtle tides had begun to turn, and in this quiet rebellion, Michelle's resolve grew stronger. The battle had not been won, but the fight had shifted in her favor. As the evening stretched on, Karen's thinly veiled disdain for Michelle grew more apparent with every passing moment. The polite sneers, the whispered remarks, they were no longer enough to satisfy her discomfort. The subtle attacks she had launched against Michelle throughout the night, veiled as innocent questions or offhand comments, had not gotten the response she expected. Michelle remained poised, calm and composed, despite the constant microaggressions. It was clear to Karen that Michelle wasn't going to play along with the role she had imagined for her. Karen's frustration built like an impending storm. She could no longer hide behind the facade of politeness. As Michelle stood at the podium, delivering her speech on the importance of education and equity, Karen stood up abruptly, cutting through the growing sense of unity in the room. The words that left her mouth were sharp, deliberate, and filled with a venom that could no longer be contained. "What makes you think you have the authority to speak on these issues?" Karen's voice rang out loud and clear, interrupting Michelle's address. "You're just a figurehead, not an expert." The room fell silent. Time seemed to stretch. As Michelle stood there, momentarily taken aback by the directness of the attack, the guests around her shifted uncomfortably, some glancing between the two women, unsure of how to react. Karen's comment wasn't just an insult, it was an attack on Michelle's credibility, her years of hard work, and her right to be in that space. The tension in the room became palpable, thick with discomfort. For a moment, Michelle felt the weight of the situation. Her mind raced as she processed the maliciousness behind Karen's words. This wasn't just an attack on her as a public figure. This was a direct assault on her integrity and contributions, framed by the invisible biases of race and privilege. This was no longer a private matter, a subtle exchange between two people. This was a societal issue, one that would speak volumes to everyone in that room. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. The room was watching, waiting for her response. In this moment, Michelle knew that grace alone would not be enough. She could not simply dismiss Karen's words with the usual poise that had always served her so well. This moment was bigger than that. The stakes were higher now, and Michelle had no choice but to meet this confrontation head-on, with the poise and power she had always embodied, but also with a firm resolve that would echo through the room. With a calm but unwavering voice, Michelle responded, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. "I don't need your permission to speak," she said, her eyes locking with Karen's. "The only authority I need is the one that comes from years of fighting for what is right, and that's more than enough." The crowd held its breath, the weight of Michelle's response leaving the room in stunned silence. The battle had shifted, Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between confrontation and staying composed? How did you handle it? The room held its breath, the tension so thick it seemed to linger in the air. Karen's words had just cut through the crowd like a razor, sharp and unrelenting. What makes you think you have the authority to speak on these issues? You're just a figurehead, not an expert. The accusation was loud, deliberate, meant to dismiss Michelle in front of a crowd of influential people. And the moment hung, heavy in the air. But Michelle did not flinch. She didn't shy away from the confrontation. Instead, she straightened, her posture exuding calm strength as she locked eyes with Karen. There was no hesitation in her stance, no sign of the doubt. Karen sought to plant. Michelle took a step forward, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. She didn't raise her voice, but her words were firm, clear, and unmistakable. "Let me remind you," Michelle began, her gaze unwavering, "that authority isn't given, it's earned." She paused, allowing her words to settle in the room, before continuing, her tone measured but intense. "I've spent my entire life fighting for the kind of change you claim to care about. I don't need to fit into your idea of who should be at the table. The table, in fact, needs to be expanded." The weight of Michelle's words filled the space, and in that moment, the room seemed to shift. For a brief second, there was silence, a stillness that hung like a heavy fog. But as her voice resonated with those who had been quietly observing, the murmurs of agreement began to rise. Some guests, who had been silent up until now, began to nod in approval. Others, visibly uncomfortable, shifted in their seats, no longer able to ignore the truth in Michelle's statement. It was as if the moment itself had shifted the dynamics of the room. Michelle didn't allow Karen's question to become a moment of self-doubt. Instead, she reclaimed it. She turned Karen's disrespect into an act of empowerment, using her own voice to challenge the assumptions that had been made about her. This confrontation was not just about Karen. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel less than because of their identity. Michelle's words cut through the room like a call to action, one that encouraged everyone to re-evaluate the spaces they occupied and who was allowed to belong in them. This moment was one of quiet power, a stand taken not through aggression but through the clarity of self-worth. Michelle had spent years fighting for justice, for the rights of others, and now, in this moment, she fought for her own place in a room where she was too often made to feel like an outsider. As Michelle stood her ground, the audience, visibly moved, began to shift in their stance. Some remained silent, but many now leaned in, their discomfort giving way to a new sense of respect. Michelle's voice had done more than defend her. It had created a ripple of empowerment throughout the room. As Michelle continued, the atmosphere in the room subtly shifted. The tension that had hung in the air seemed to loosen, the weight of her words settling into the hearts of those around her. It was as if the crowd collectively exhaled, but the shift was more than just relief. It was a quiet turning point, a moment where the room began to align itself with the truth Michelle had laid bare. Jessica, who had stepped forward earlier, found herself standing even closer to Michelle now. Her earlier hesitations had evaporated in the face of Michelle's bravery. Standing tall beside her, Jessica's voice gained strength, her words becoming a quiet declaration of support. "I've seen the work she's done," Jessica said, her eyes never leaving Karen. "She has earned her place here, and if you can't see that, maybe you should question what you really stand for." Her words were simple but firm, and they reverberated through the crowd. The room, which had once been divided by silent indifference, was now unified in its support for Michelle. One by one, more individuals, those who had been standing back, watching, began to step forward, either with a nod of agreement or quietly offering words of solidarity. It was as if Jessica's bravery had given them permission to do the same. They were no longer passive bystanders. They had been moved to act. Jake, the journalist, who had hesitated earlier, was the next to step into the fray. He stood up, camera in hand, capturing the moment for the world to see. "I've interviewed many people in my career," Jake said, his voice steady but carrying weight. "But Michelle Obama's work in social justice has far outpaced most in this room. We should be listening to her, not questioning her." As Jake's words echoed, more guests, once silent observers, began to speak up. They murmured their agreement with Michelle's message, some offering quiet praise for her unwavering commitment to education and equality. The once awkward silence that had filled the room now buzzed with quiet conversations about Michelle's contributions, her legacy, and the importance of listening to voices that had long been silenced. The crowd's energy shifted. What had been a tense discomfort now gave way to a quiet but powerful support. Michelle's courage to stand tall and call out injustice had ignited something in the room. Her response to Karen had become more than a defense of herself. It was a call to action for others to stand up, to speak out, and to refuse to allow prejudice to fester unchecked. The subtle shift from indifference to support was palpable. It was a reminder that when someone speaks truth to power, it doesn't just make a difference in the moment, it ripples out, creating a wave of courage and solidarity that could transform a room, a conversation, or even a society. Karen, visibly shaken by the shift in the room, tried to recover from her unprovoked attack, but it was too late. The words she had uttered, dripping with subtle prejudice, were now out in the open, laid bare for everyone to see. There was no going back. The tension in the room was palpable, and the uncomfortable silence that followed her outburst was like a slow unraveling of the facade she had carefully maintained. The weight of her words hung heavily in the air, and the cracks in her carefully constructed defenses were starting to show. Michelle, unflinching, continued with her speech, her voice steady and resolute. As she spoke, the power of her words left no room for Karen's sheltered worldview, and it became increasingly clear that Michelle was more than capable of speaking truth to power. With every word, Michelle reminded the room of the need for equity and justice, not just for those on the stage, but for every person in the crowd, every person who had been silenced or overlooked. Karen's worldview, which had seemed unchallenged until now, was suddenly exposed as incomplete and outdated, no longer able to exist in the face of the real, pressing issues Michelle addressed. The camera flashes came like a series of staccato bursts as Jake, the journalist, took a step back, instinctively capturing the raw emotion of the moment. His camera wasn't just recording an interaction, it was capturing a moment of societal reckoning. Soon after, the video of the exchange began circulating on social media, and it quickly gained traction. The footage spread like wildfire, with viewers commenting in support of Michelle's powerful stand. People shared the message online, amplifying her words of justice, equity, and inclusion, while condemning Karen's open attack. What had once been a quiet, hidden prejudice was now fully exposed for what it was: unwarranted, unjust, and rooted in bias. As the video went viral, Karen's previously subtle bigotry was brought into the light. Michelle had turned a personal attack into a public lesson for the entire room. In doing so, she not only highlighted Karen's discriminatory assumptions, but also drew attention to the pervasive nature of racism in spaces that prided themselves on doing good. By simply being herself, by refusing to let Karen's judgment define her, Michelle dismantled the false narratives many in the room, Karen included, held about who truly deserved to be heard. As Karen realized the backlash against her words, the uncomfortable silence enveloped her. No one was offering her support. No one came to her defense. In stark contrast, Michelle's message reverberated louder, clearer, and more powerful than before. The room had shifted completely. Karen's subtle prejudices were now fully exposed, and the response left her isolated, her power stripped away. Meanwhile, Michelle's position grew stronger, her voice echoing across a space that had once tried to silence her. The tension in the room reached a breaking point. What had started as a quiet discomfort, a barely noticeable shift in the atmosphere, now exploded into a palpable sense of urgency. The balance had tipped, and there was no turning back. Karen, once a figure of authority, now stood alone. Her words no longer carrying weight, her privileged position built on assumptions and unchallenged biases had been shattered in front of the crowd. The confidence she had once held in her space now seemed fragile and exposed, the cracks too deep to ignore. Michelle, on the other hand, had emerged as a leader in the moment. Her strength was undeniable, her voice not just a response, but a rallying cry. She had taken on the challenge of defending herself, but in doing so she had also lifted the room around her. The crowd's support for Michelle became more visible with every passing second. Whispers of admiration spread through the room, growing louder as the reality of what had just occurred set in. Guests who had been passive or hesitant now began to speak out, their words full of quiet resolve. They began to challenge Karen's assumptions, some even calling attention to the need for inclusivity and the importance of confronting prejudice, no matter how subtle. The shift from apathy to engagement was undeniable. No longer could people stand by and let harmful attitudes fester unchecked. Michelle's words had ignited a collective realization. This was not just about her. It was about everyone in the room, about the systems they had all been complicit in, whether intentionally or by simply remaining silent. Michelle's quiet strength and unwavering commitment to justice had awakened something within them all. Some of the guests, who had once been content to remain silent observers, now began to make personal pledges to do more. They promised themselves to speak up when they saw racism or injustice, to no longer allow subtle bigotry to go unchallenged. The room, once divided between those who noticed the problem and those who ignored it, was now united in its awareness. The growing support for Michelle and the increasing discomfort surrounding Karen's actions illuminated the larger societal change taking place, one moment at a time. The tension between personal growth and systemic change had never been clearer. Michelle's ability to lead by example, even in the face of blatant discrimination, had sparked a fire in the hearts of those present, and it was clear that things would never be the same. Do you believe the shift in this room is reflective of larger societal changes? What can we do to ensure that subtle racism is challenged in our own communities? The fallout from the evening's confrontation was swift and unavoidable. As the event drew to a close, the buzz of conversation about Michelle's powerful speech and Karen's prejudiced remarks was palpable, reverberating through the venue and spilling out into the streets. The room, once thick with tension, now simmered with a collective awareness. The video of the exchange quickly went viral, and the ripple effect began to spread faster than anyone could have anticipated. On social media, people from all walks of life expressed their admiration for Michelle's grace under pressure, highlighting how she had managed to dismantle Karen's bigotry without raising her voice or resorting to aggression. In the hours and days that followed, the conversation extended far beyond Michelle's personal encounter with Karen. People began sharing their own experiences with discrimination at charity events and other spaces where privilege went unchecked, often masked behind polite smiles and well-intentioned words. These stories poured into public forums, sparking a broader and more urgent discussion about the need for diversity, inclusivity, and the dismantling of systemic racism in spaces that purported to champion social good. Michelle's strength had triggered something much bigger than one isolated incident. It had ignited a much-needed conversation about the racial dynamics at play within philanthropic circles and across society as a whole. Karen's actions, now exposed for what they truly were, had ignited a wave of accountability that reverberated through the event's social network. Her sponsors, upon seeing the viral video, began to distance themselves from her. Her reputation, once carefully cultivated in circles of influence, now started to crack. The charity organization hosting the event, which had initially been slow to react, quickly released a statement condemning Karen's remarks and assuring the public that they would take actionable steps to ensure inclusivity at all future events. The pressure for change was undeniable, and the organization felt the weight of public scrutiny. Karen, now publicly outed for her bigotry, was left to reckon with the consequences of her actions. Her social isolation deepened as she found herself abandoned by those who had once supported her, the weight of her biases and assumptions now fully exposed. Michelle, on the other hand, emerged as not only a leader for speaking out in the moment, but as a role model for social change, demonstrating how one person's willingness to challenge prejudice could spark a movement for transformation. Her calm resilience had turned the situation into a powerful catalyst for the broader work that remained. Michelle's message was clear. This fight was far from over, but the fight for justice and equality would always go on. In the days following the event, Michelle found herself reflecting deeply on what had transpired. The experience was painful, undeniably so, but it also proved to be incredibly empowering. It wasn't just the direct confrontation with Karen that stung, it was the weight of the countless others who had endured the same or similar forms of injustice, who had been dismissed, devalued, and marginalized because of their race. Michelle recognized that the battle wasn't just hers, it was a collective struggle. As she sat quietly, reflecting on the events, she felt an overwhelming sense of solidarity with everyone who had ever faced prejudice, whose voices had been silenced in similar spaces. Her mind often returned to the speech she had delivered that evening. She had spoken from the heart, from a place of deep conviction, but it wasn't until later that she realized the true power of what had happened. She had always been the advocate, standing up for others, fighting for equality, justice, and social change. But in that moment, she had done something for herself that she hadn't always given herself permission to do. She had stood up for her own worth. For so long, Michelle had channeled her energy into advocating for others, sometimes at the cost of asserting her own value in spaces where her presence had been questioned. In that room, under the weight of Karen's dismissive attitude, she had drawn a clear line. She was not just an advocate for others, she was also an advocate for herself. As she reflected on the pivotal moments of her life, Michelle saw the thread that connected her struggles. Growing up in a working-class family in Chicago, where she often had to fight for recognition and respect, to navigating predominantly white spaces in academia, and then leading a nation as First Lady, Michelle had faced countless barriers. She had always fought to make space for voices like hers, voices that had often been left out of the narrative. But through it all, Michelle had learned one crucial thing: her voice mattered. She had always had the power to speak truth to power, to stand tall in the face of adversity, and to be an example of courage and resilience. The experience at the charity event, though challenging, only reinforced her commitment to continue the work she had been doing for years, advocating for equality, justice, and empowerment. The incident had ignited something within her, reminding her of her purpose and the reason she had stepped into this work in the first place. With every challenge she faced, Michelle grew more determined to use her platform to not only rise above these barriers, but to help others do the same. It was no longer just about one battle. It was about a lifelong commitment to creating spaces where everyone's voice could be heard and everyone's worth could be recognized. The incident at the charity event quickly became a focal point for a much larger conversation about race, power and accountability within philanthropic spaces. As the video of the confrontation between Michelle and Karen spread rapidly across social media, it didn't just highlight one individual's prejudice, it exposed a deep-seated issue that had long been ignored in spaces that championed doing good. The ripple effect was immediate, sparking conversations that reached far beyond the walls of the event and touching organizations across the country. For the first time, charity leaders, who had long been accustomed to maintaining the status quo, found themselves under intense scrutiny. The focus was no longer solely on raising funds or ensuring smooth operations. Instead, the spotlight turned to how their organizations had perpetuated systemic issues of exclusion, racism, and tokenization. Many began re-evaluating their practices and questioning how they could create more inclusive spaces that not only accepted but also valued the contributions of marginalized voices. The status quo was no longer acceptable, and the pressure to address the underlying systemic racism in these spaces became impossible to ignore. In the aftermath of the incident, a wave of change began to take shape. Organizations began implementing new policies designed to ensure greater diversity in leadership and more accountability for discrimination. Workshops on unconscious bias, diversity training, and open forums for discussing race and inclusion were introduced as standard practices. The conversation shifted from simply acknowledging diversity to actively amplifying marginalized voices. These voices, once tokenized for appearances or ignored altogether, were now seen as critical to the success and integrity of the organizations they worked for. The emphasis was no longer on giving opportunities to underrepresented groups simply to meet quotas, but on ensuring that their contributions were valued and integrated into the fabric of the organization's mission. Michelle, as she had done for years, continued to use her platform to advocate for these necessary changes. In interviews and public speeches, she called out the ways in which charity organizations and institutions had long overlooked the very people they claimed to serve. She used her own experience to illustrate how even the smallest acts of discrimination could perpetuate a much larger problem of systemic oppression. She reminded everyone that personal actions, no matter how subtle, had consequences, and that it was time for those in positions of power to be held accountable. By confronting the small, seemingly insignificant act of discrimination in that room, Michelle had ignited a larger conversation about the structures that enable these attitudes to persist. The power of her response didn't just call for personal accountability. It demanded systemic reform, challenging individuals and organizations to look at their own practices and take responsibility for the inequalities they had helped perpetuate. Michelle's courage became a catalyst for change, one that rippled through the charity world and beyond, urging a collective reckoning with the systemic racism that had long been ignored. As Michelle took time to reflect on her experience, she realized that the change she sought wasn't just about condemning racism when it was overt or blatant. It wasn't just about the obvious moments where prejudice rears its ugly head. It was about transforming the systems that allowed racism to thrive in subtle, insidious ways. The truth was, those moments, small, quiet, almost invisible, were often the most dangerous. They were the moments that could slip under the radar, the ones that could be brushed off with a smile or a polite comment. And yet, they were the very foundation upon which larger acts of discrimination were built. Michelle understood that the power to create real, lasting change lay in acknowledging those moments of discomfort, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, and taking action to correct them. The work of dismantling systemic racism wasn't just about reacting in the moment. It was about fostering a culture of inclusivity that permeates every aspect of life. Whether in the workplace, in schools, or in social settings, This work had to be ongoing and intentional. The systems that perpetuated inequality had been built over time, and they would take time to dismantle. But that didn't mean change was impossible. It meant that everyone, no matter their position, had a part to play. In her speeches, Michelle continued to call on her audience to examine their own roles in perpetuating inequality. She encouraged them to think beyond the obvious and to question their assumptions about race, privilege, and the spaces they occupied. Standing up against discrimination was not just about reacting in the moment. It was about actively working to create a more just world every day. It was about speaking up, even when the issue felt uncomfortable, and making it clear that subtle racism would not be tolerated. Michelle's message was simple. Silence in the face of injustice was no longer acceptable. People had to take responsibility for their own actions and for the systems that supported inequality. She encouraged her audience to speak up, to question assumptions, and to take active steps to challenge racism in its most subtle forms. This story ends on a note of hope and empowerment. Michelle's courage in the face of prejudice didn't just impact the people in the room that evening. It inspired countless others to take action in their own lives. By standing firm in her beliefs and demanding justice, Michelle proved that individual actions could spark wider societal change. The lesson is clear. We all have the responsibility to challenge injustice, and it starts with having the courage to speak out, just as Michelle did. How can we ensure that subtle racism is addressed in our own communities? What steps can we take to challenge prejudice in everyday situations? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories like this. Together we can raise awareness and create change.